Okay. Hello, this is the process counterplans backfile check elective. The original premise of this was to run through a bunch of random process counterplan things that have occurred over history, over time. The way that I've done this has evolved into kind of going through the terms in the topic and talking about genres of counterplans that can be made to compete against various aspects of the resolution that have a little bit more of a cheating flavor to them. So this is not all of the examples that I'm going to list are going to be process counterplans. Part of the reason for that is that I think the best process counterplans are those that minimize their exposure to being accused of being a process counterplan in the first place, right? Like typically you think of a process counterplan as, well, actually, I'm kind of curious about this. Like what, if you all had to define what a process counterplan is, what would you say?
It's a counterplan that does the plan through a different
Yeah, so does the plan is something that I would quibble with, right? Because if that definition, I assume is the definition you would give in like a theory debate where you're saying process counterplans are bad or like a voting issue, right? The issue with that is that in order to demonstrate that the counterplan does the plan, you have to first win a competition debate that says that the counterplan is in fact not different than the plan, right? The thing that it does is actually the plan. What's up? Yeah, right. Oh, were you in? Oh, Jacon's not here? Yeah. Oh, Turner's not here. Got it. Okay. Cool. Okay. Yeah, so but I think that's a pretty common definition of what a process counterplan is. This like does something that amounts to like the core essence of the plan, however we define that, even if it severs some elements that specify the specific procedure for enacting it. And so generally speaking, because we don't, when we're reading a counterplan, we obviously don't want to say that it does the plan. Part of that is also, our ability to do that is enhanced whenever we can differentiate ourselves from a core mechanism of the resolution rather than just something like should or USFG or yeah.
So there's like a better definition where it like creates a process that may result in the plan or like result very similar to the plan.
Yeah, I think that's an improvement on the definition. Generally speaking, like, again, like I think when you're neg, at least, you want to avoid characterizing your counterplan as different process to result in the plan as much as possible. You want to say something more along the lines of a mechanism that is distinct from the plan, but results in similarly solvent outcomes or like outcomes that can similarly access the important components of the case. So the way that I would like to structure this is I'm mostly just going to go through all the different words in the topic, and I'm going to talk about ways that you can exploit these words for competition purposes. And once we've done a fairly comprehensive survey of that, we'll do a little bit more of an open-ended conversation about any notions that you all might have or specific things that might have come up on past topics that are not uniquely strong on this topic, but are just kind of perennially reoccurring type of things. So the first words in the resolution are the United States federal government should, right? So the first word in the resolution is the. The in process counterplan land, the main definition that people typically invoke for the is that the refers to the whole. So when you talk about the table or the room, you're referring to the entire room as opposed to one of its subcomponents. So in the context of the United States federal government, what we would be saying is that because it's the United States federal government, it's referring to not only the one, but the entire. So what kinds of things do we think that this generates competition for if it's the entire United States federal government? Or put another way, what counterplans are not the entire United States federal government? Yeah, agent counterplans. So we'll circle back to this theme a little bit more because I think that there are better ways to come up with the agent counterplan theme on this topic a little bit later. But broadly speaking, if you want to speak to themes of interbranch conflict, if you want to talk about Congress passing something or the executive passing something or the courts passing something, the is a useful term in your competition arsenal. For United States federal government, there are, surprisingly, even on this topic with its international focus, a lot of flavors of states that I think are going to be relevant. One is there's a pretty basic, just like the states should engage in international outreach counterplan. Have people heard of the term paradiplomacy? Paradiplomacy? Yeah, so that's a Google search that's worth doing if you're interested in writing this. The idea of paradiplomacy is that different levels of government, including states and even cities, can engage in their own diplomatic outreach efforts that mirror the diplomatic outreach efforts that occur at the federal level, but can sometimes even work at cross purposes with them to accomplish different kinds of foreign policy objectives. A common example that people point to with this is California's participation routinely in global climate conversations. California is a very significant economy. Their economy is much larger than many entire countries. And so California is a powerful voice on the world stage to negotiate climate agreements. And security cooperation is a little bit different because security cooperation and military issues generally are more of a federal issue typically than economic or environmental issues like that one. But the states do have some levers that they can use to interact in the realm of security too. So the National Guard is a component of the US government and the component of the US military that works in a very unique way, which is that unless they are nationalized, the default operating procedure for the National Guard is actually that they're overseen by the states. So each state runs its own National Guard. They're responsible for keeping them ready, for training them, for managing most recruitment stuff. They can be absorbed by the federal government, but that's not like the routine way that they work. As part of state National Guard programs, there's a thing called the State Partnership Program. Has anyone ever heard of this? Basically, the National Guard can go overseas. State National Guard units can go overseas and engage in security partnerships with other countries. They do training, they do, basic security assistance. They routinely do cyber cooperation. Not so much in these other emerging tech areas, but there is evidence to suggest that the states could undertake a lot of programs in this area. Obviously, this would avoid any dissent to federal government action. And this paradiplomacy premise can be coupled with it as an internal net benefit to say that states carving out a role for themselves in foreign policy is valuable. Other counterplans that fiat the states try to use the states to compel federal action. So many of you are probably familiar with the Constitutional Convention counterplan, which has gained a lot of popularity in recent years. This counterplan uses a constitutional provision for amending the Constitution, which allows the states, a certain number of states, to get together and without the involvement of the federal government, amend the Constitution by getting together in a constitutional convention. This is in Article 5 of the Constitution. There's several ways that you can do an amendment, and this is one of them. It's never happened, but theoretically it would allow states to alter federal law without changing or without engaging federal policymakers, which would also avoid things like politics. This is totally brain dead on a foreign policy topic. The idea that the Constitution would contain any provision that specifies exact courses of foreign policy is ridiculous. But this is likely a thing that people are going to try to do. Generally speaking, on the AF, when we're talking about a lot of these, one thing that you want to look out for in building your 2ACs and constructing your themes of deficits is having an AF where some kind of semblance of procedural regularity or some kind of semblance of confidence, whatever you're doing is confidence inspiring among our partners is an important component to have, because many of these process counterplans, while theoretically possible and while within the realm of neg fiat arguably, are so outrageous in the real world that it would be very easy for a prepared AF to demonstrate that process would make us look completely ridiculous to our international partners, and they would not, feel that this program represents, the US putting their best foot forward and being prepared to engage in serious substantive cooperation. And the CONCON counterplan is a great example of this would look completely outrageous to our allies. Another AF theme to look out for is counterplans that use weird different processes. A lot of the times, the reason those processes are not common in foreign policy is that they produce unnecessary rigidity. Something that's unique about foreign policy as opposed to domestic policy is it's mainly the prerogative of the executive branch. And the reason for this is that foreign policy changes really fast. Like there's a lot of emergencies that happen. There's a lot of quickly shifting stuff that occurs that the executive needs to respond to really, really quickly. And so part of the reason why the executive has so much control is that the executive, because of it's very centralized, right? They have the ability to make these quick, rapid pivots so they can respond to changing events on the world stage. Stuff like the CONCON counterplan, and we'll circle back to other examples of this, are poorly suited to foreign policy because they lock the US into these choices in a way that executive or like the normal way of doing things would not. And so that's another way to think about, constructing your AF answers. For CONCON in particular, you'll want to look at the college wiki on executive power, which has a lot of arguments for why constitutional or external constraints on foreign policy are bad. Uncooperative federalism. We heard of this counterplan? Yeah, so this counterplan, fun fact, was originally written for a foreign policy topic, even though one would think that this would also be one that doesn't make a ton of sense on a foreign policy topic. But here the idea is the states threaten the federal government with the suspension of all cooperative programs, and the stick is so overwhelming that the threat of this will induce the federal government to do the AF. The states have a ton of leverage. It'll get the government to say yes. And it sets this precedent that states should be uncooperative with the federal government. It spills over to a new model of federalism. Another set of things that compete with the United States federal government is international counterplans. And here there's kind of a spectrum of processiness. There's obviously the vanilla international counterplan, which is just another actor should be the one that does the thing. These are going to be more powerful in the context of norms AFs mainly, or AFs that speak to the importance of legal interpretations. There are international bodies that are much better suited to creating consensus behind international legal interpretation than the military alliance of NATO. So can anyone think of some examples? I'm sure you all have done some research in lab about some of these at least. Yeah. The EU is more economically focused, and so there's an argument that they would be better at norm promotion than NATO as a military alliance, but there's some probably, think of like, if you have not chosen these paths, it's likely because you have not been willing to use international fiat. But if you could fiat any actor to set a global norm, what would it be? Probably the UN, yeah. I think there's a lot of organizations within the UN in particular, if you wanted to get even more specific, that you could get a lot of leeway out of. An example, so which one of those will probably depend on what kind of AF you're debating once again. So legal interpretation type stuff, you're going to want to go with the ICJ, or you're going to want to have the UN make a proclamation of some kind. AFs that focus on human rights violations or legal accountability for misuses of particular types of military systems. The International Criminal Court is a reasonable candidate. But so there's those direct kind of international fiat type of stuff. You can even argue that the US or NATO would follow on as a result of the UN or another international actor having changed their legal interpretation of a thing. I would say AFs that reinterpret Article 5 even are somewhat vulnerable to this. One would think that reinterpreting Article 5 would create a good NATO key warrant, but international counterplans that change in a way that credibly generates international consensus, what the threshold is for what constitutes a use of force, given the linkage between the concept of the use of force and the concept of an armed attack under Article 5, there's a pretty reasonable argument, I think, for the NEG to make that those changes can spill over to affect NATO policy, even without fiating NATO directly. There's also a slightly more cheating approach. So once again, moving further down the spectrum, you can fiat that a variety of actors cooperate with NATO. So the EU could cooperate with NATO. There's a lot of advocates for that, that speak to the importance of EU-NATO relations that are independent of the US for strong European strategic autonomy. There's also questions that could be asked about who initiates the cooperation. So even among the same actors that the resolution uses, which are the US and NATO, there is a question about who starts the process or who gets the ball rolling on the cooperation process. Fundamentally, there's no reason for a lot of AFs that it has to be the US. The US is certainly an important NATO member, but the US cooperating with NATO is mechanically not different than any other NATO member cooperating with NATO, because the US is also a NATO member, right? So in the same way that the US cooperates with NATO to set a new norm, the UK could do that, or Canada could do that. Again, for some of these major political issues, there's going to be a pretty good say no argument, or reasons why fiating US consensus or US acquiescence to the new principle would be important. But for a lot of these more amorphous norms arguments, or for arguments that have a less, they try to get around the say yes debate by framing their solvency mechanism around something less than legal change. So like investing in research and development, something, informal Article 4 consultations or something like that. Those things could be triggered by any NATO member, and that would also avoid US domestic disads. Also, NATO, this genre can be coupled with security cooperation picks, which I'll circle back to in a little bit. But has anyone seen definitions of security cooperation that say stuff like military to military cooperation, or it's the DoD, right? So NATO, as you might remember from the topic lecture, has political components and military components. So on the military front, we have the military chain of command headed by SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, right? On the political side, we have the North Atlantic Council, which is just a place where all the allies meet and have political meetings. Those are not attended by military members from the, from their respective governments. They're attended by political representatives, like the presidents might show up, or like diplomats might show up. And so there's an argument to be made that stuff involving the NAC is not security cooperation. And if you couple that with this international fiat business, you could fiat a lot of stuff just starts with the NAC, and that could generate some net benefits as well. Okay, now that we move past the USFG, we're getting to kind of the meat and potatoes words for process counterplan competition. So this is the pile involving, we skipped over resolved, but like resolved is definitely in this stew. We've got our should, we've got our substantial, and of course we've got our the from earlier, right? So this is the stuff that comes at the core of what you were talking about when we were saying like do the app through a different process, right? This is what people imagine as that. And I think that there is a couple of core categories of this. One is recommendation counterplans. So who can take a stab at saying what a recommendation counterplan is? Yeah.
So my interpretation of it is that the United States asks, well, like in past topics has been that like the United States asks some other body, whether like foreign or national, over what to provide a recommendation on whether or not they should do the plan.
I would say that that's an example of a different category, which I would refer to. I would describe that as consult. Recommendation is a little bit different. Yeah.
I think were they that like they're asking to recommend the plan to, I guess, to pass.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't fiat the plan, you begin some sort of process to build political support for the plan in such a way that results in the plan passing. I think the two classic examples of this are the commission counterplan. So the commission counterplan was like a 2007 invention. It was like popularized in 2007. It made an appearance in the block in the finals of the NDT on alliances. This counterplan creates a commission of experts that is nonpartisan and has them go through the process of studying the AF area. And at the conclusion of this process, this like group of credible nonpartisan people comes out and recommends the AF. And the idea is that once the commission recommends the AF, because of the intellectual heft that commission brings to the table, people would have a lot of political trouble rejecting the commission's proposals. An even more abusive version of this actually, sorry?
The study counterplan?
Study counterpoint. So I would categorize that as a separate thing because I think the competition argument is a little bit different. So with recommend counterplans as a category, part of what makes them, they're kind of the best of this bunch, I would say, in terms of the competition argument that they can make, because they can say with a straight face that like in no world are they actually fiating the plan, right? It's not like if this happens, then we fiat the plan, or like if this happens, then we do something else, right? None of that. It's literally just the commission only, or the counterplan only fiats one thing, and it's the recommendation, right? So because it's just the recommendation, if the AF stands up and says, well, counterplans that fiat the AF are a voting issue, the NEG is going to stand up and say, we don't, we just fiat. Someone says the AF should happen. It's no different than like the state's counterplan making a follow-on argument, right? So study, I would say, is different, because if the study counterplan, if the AF survives the study, or if the study ends up recommending the AF, then they do actually fiat, the plan happens, right? So the more cheating version of commissions that I was going to mention was, there are versions of, there are laws that basically pre-authorize the commission recommendations to pass. The way that this works is basically, so the commission is created, the commission is empowered to make recommendations, and then in the law that creates the commission, it says whatever the commission recommends, unless it will pass 90 days or however many days after the commission recommends it, unless Congress affirmatively steps in and votes against. And either because the commission is super credible, or because the plan is popular to begin with, although unlikely that, because typically the net benefits commissions is politics, or because Congress is simply too gridlocked to vote on anything if they don't have to, or if they're not fiated to. The NEG would argue that by changing the default from nothing to passage, the plan would just pass after the 90-day period, because Congress would not get together to take a vote to strike down the plan. This is a little bit more tenuous because, again, as I was just saying, recommend counterplans get a lot of benefit out of being able to say we do not actually fiat the plan. This one arguably fiats the plan, right? Because it says it uses fiat to change the presumption from the plan not passing to the plan passing. So it could also be thought of as condition the plan on Congress not voting against it, if that makes sense. Is that a hand?
Yeah.
Yeah, what's up?
Like, what do you think is the best like answer to one that make like goes with the angle that like it doesn't result in like exactly the plan, but something similar for the purposes?
So, oh, you mean for recommend counterplans in particular? So, so again, I would say it's not quite, the NEG is not quite arguing that the competition stems from the recommendation resulting in a different outcome. It is that fiat is not being used at all to cause the plan to happen, right? So to take a step back, how do we know when fiat is being used? It's when a say no argument can be dismissed by saying like, this is something that the plan or the counter plan stipulates or waves away and makes into a should question rather than a will question, because it says in the counter plan text, which contains the word should, that we should do a particular thing, right? So recommend counterplans don't do this for the plan's enactment. They only do this for the recommendation. So the competition argument is not based on it causes something different. The recommendation competition argument is based on it causes nothing by fiat. It only causes the plan by effect. I would say competition is not the best approach against, or perm do the counterplan rather, is not really the best approach against recommend counterplans. I would recommend the perm do both angle. So perm do both will generally work with a recommend counterplan, because the recommend counterplan will say that at the end of some steps, the plan is an outcome of the recommendation. So the perm to do both would simply sequence the recommendation first and the plan after. Their argument in response would be that this is intrinsic because it adds delay, or like severance because it severs immediacy. They'll define should as immediate, they'll define resolved as certain, or not resolved as certain, they'll define like resolved as immediate, substantial as immediate, and they'll say that your perm adds that element of delay or subtracts that element of immediacy. And in response to that, you should just counter define those words and say, you know, we should not interpret those words that way. Interpreting those words that way causes delay counterplans, those are bad. But perm do both, if you're allowed to delay the plan, clearly resolves any net benefit to any recommended counterplan. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. The other classic recommendation counterplan is the nuclear posture review counterplan. So this is part of a variety of counterplans. The US periodically releases a variety of strategy documents. They have a word salad or like letter salad of acronym set of names for them. There's like the Nuclear Posture Review, there's National Military Strategy, there's the Quadrennial Defense Review. They've like changed their names over the course of administrations. Each president likes to like shake things up and like call it by a new name, but essentially the unifying feature of all of these is that they take a broad area of policy and they summarize the opinions of the president about the set of policy, just in terms of big picture, like what are the strategic goals that we're trying to accomplish? How do we as an administration want to think about the set of stuff? Nuclear posture review obviously has to do with nuclear weapons. What is our declaratory policy? What are we going to like say to other countries we want to do with our nuclear weapons? As well as, you know, capabilities, like what capabilities or what concrete systems or weapons does the president think that we need in a particular area? The defense review ones, or the national military strategy ones, or the national security strategy, or there are also theater security cooperation reviews, which is likely to be the most topic specific one of these. All of these do a bunch of research and then come out with these recommendations about their particular subset of foreign policy. And the idea, similar to the commission counterplan, would be that the process of going through this, you know, report drafting thing, the process of doing all of this research, gets all the stakeholders on board, because the process of formulating these documents generally involves like talking to everybody, soliciting everyone's views, like, hey Manchin, what do you think about this? Like, what's your input? Like, let's get your views into this document so that when push comes to shove and we have to actually push this through to implementation, we know that you're going to be on board because your views have been incorporated into the drafting process. And so through things like that, the idea is that these documents are the product of political consensus. And so once they're actually passed, that results in say yes, and it avoids political backlash or avoids other kinds of problems. A common theme with a lot of these is civil military relations. Is that a theme that anybody has heard about? Civil military relations. So the academic definition of this is the way that the civilian and the military branches of the government institutionally interact with one another. It is considered to be good CMR to have the civilians be in charge of the military, while at the same time having a respectful back and forth where military views are considered by the civilians informing their policy. But in debate, typically the way that people talk about CMR is just like, are the civilians and the military on friendly terms with one another? Do they have a strong working relationship? Are they incorporating each other's views? Is the well poisoned by groupthink, where like the civilians and military all think the same thing, and so there's not a healthy debate or like exchange of views going on? And the impact to all of this is broadly the erosion of the quality of military decision making, resulting in foreign policy errors, mismanagement of crises. A lot of these defense review type things are designed to maintain healthy CMR by encouraging civilians and military people to get together in a room, exchange their views, and like write down a consensus set of positions in a policy document. And so the idea is that the process of this dialogue benefits CMR, while skipping the process by simply fiating the plan short circuits that dialogue and results in one group simply fiating their views onto the other, which is detrimental to this relationship. So that's recommendation counterplans. Does that make sense? Okay. Then we've got what you were alluding to, Max, a second ago, which is kind of the study / research / impact statement genre of counterplan. Things that have come up in recent past recurrently: race impact statement. Check if the plan is racist. If it is not, do it. This solves racism. Human rights impact assessment or human rights impact statement. Check if the plan hurts human rights. If it does not, do it. If it does, modify it so that it doesn't, or scrap it. This avoids hurting human rights. Yeah.
Last year there was like the national environment, like the NEPA counterplan.
Yep.
Do you think that'll have like that? Do you think that will be
I do.
on this topic?
Yeah, all of these counterplans are, again, not the best of the process stuff. Like I said, the best of the process stuff competes off of the topic words, and we'll get to that in a second. But I do think that that is another common one. So that's
environmental impact assessment. Do you think will still be a big part of this topic?
Yeah, exactly. And that counterplan, as you might imagine, checks if the plan hurts the environment. If it does, modifies it. For a lot of these, it's not just that you have to win a dissent to the plan, that like the plan without modification would hurt the environment. A lot of these counterplans claim that the precedent of doing a binding review with either of these processes kind of normalizes the scrupulous following of these assessments by various agencies, and that results in these processes being followed in the future when actually racist or actually human rights violating or actually environmentally damaging policy would have been enacted and would be avoided by institutionalizing this culture of doing these assessments in a rigorous and faithful way. Not so relevant on this topic, but have come up in the past, so I'll just throw them out there. Our Constitution impact statement and federalism impact statement, which check if the plan hurts federalism or violates the Constitution. So that is the study genre that is generic or has come up in the past. So the last study thing that I will mention is probably my most speculative idea. So generally speaking, so security cooperation as a term is kind of tricky, and it has a pretty long history. So during the Clinton administration, so in the late 90s, the term that was favored was security engagement, or just engagement in general. And this referred to the same sort of umbrella of activities that security cooperation refers to today. But when Bush came into office, Bush kind of pushed through the replacement of the term engagement with the term security cooperation. And the idea behind that replacement was that engagement is too unfocused. Engagement doesn't really say why we are engaging. It just says talk to people or make contacts for those contacts' sake. And security cooperation kind of refines the issue, because instead of saying cooperate for no reason or cooperate just in general, it specifies that the reason that we're cooperating is the goal of security promotion, or it's the goal of creating secure environments within whatever country we're cooperating with, right? And so the idea was to create a set of benchmarks for the goals of this process. So that, to me, you know, there's a lot of cards that say this, that like, this is the core difference between security cooperation and alternatives in terms of the terminology, is that security cooperation is tied to particular performance metrics that are measurable and that are linked to security outcomes. Now, that would seem like the AF is the one that is committed to study, right? But there's also a different wrinkle, which is that although there's an umbrella term, security cooperation, that refers to a lot of these activities, the legal authorities for a lot of that stuff are split across like 80 different statutes. And there's like many iterations of Congressional Research Service and like RAND reports that are just like, the military keeps going to Congress and complaining like, hey, every time we want to do a security cooperation thing, we have to like cobble together the authority to do the thing from like 6 different laws. We have to spend a ton of like person hours to figure out what actually allows us to do this thing. And we usually succeed because there's so fucking many of them, but like, it's really hard. It's annoying to figure out exactly what the rules are that authorize us to do these things. And so I think you could go one of 2 directions, both of which kind of have a study angle. One of which is to pick out of security metrics for measuring success. So given the, you know, the deep linkage of the term security cooperation versus engagement to like these measurable security outcomes, I think it could arguably be competitive to link the AF's performance metric to a different set of success outcomes. Like, maybe human security is different than other kinds of security, or maybe we want to shy away from security altogether and think about the issue in economic terms, right? So, or maybe even think about the issue broadly in terms of governance, right? How can we create, you know, high quality norms? A lot of the AFs are concerned with this, but we'll still use the term security cooperation, which has this deep linkage to like measuring output variables in security terms. The net benefit, there can be a variety of net benefits to this, obviously, depending on which replacement you use. And the answer to the permutation would be that if you incorporate security-based metrics, you would dilute the ability to measure or enforce the alternative thing. The other one that would try to solve the problem of authority fragmentation would be a counterplan that reorients security cooperation away from working in terms of small tactical issues and towards broad field-wide strategic assessment. A lot of people advocate for replacing this patchwork of authorities with unified authorities that authorize genres of activities across lots of areas. So like instead of a law for security cooperation with NATO on AI, and then a law for security cooperation with NATO on cyber, and a law for security cooperation with Japan on those issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Instead of these narrow laws that specialize and try to do stuff for their own sake, right? Just like do stuff with NATO because doing stuff with NATO is good. We want to think in terms of broad strategy. What are the broad, grand issues, worldwide issues that we're trying to accomplish with our engagement, and measure our concrete stuff on whether it measures up to those particular benchmarks. And so the way that the counterplan would work is, instead of passing a narrow authorization for the plan, it would pass a broad authorization that authorizes the plan if and only if it's compliant with a set of strategy guidelines, and it integrates the plan into a broad grand strategy that helps us accomplish whatever goal the counterplan would specify. And it would say that the permutation derails that, because forcing the plan through without integration with this assessment derails the holistic nature of the assessment, unbalances the way that we allocate resources between programs, all this kind of stuff. So just like we need to look at the big picture all at once, we have to do an assessment that takes everything into account. Nothing can be a sacred cow. Otherwise, other stuff will slip through too, yada, yada. Does that general idea make some sense? Okay. I will briefly rattle off some other things. So then we have consult. Consult, you mentioned this a little bit ago. We can consult the Joint Chiefs of Staff, also with a civil military relations net benefit. These are the generals in charge of the military. We can also consult other allies. We can consult Japan. We can consult members of the Quad. We can consult the EU. If you buy that the NAC is diplomatic and working with them is not security cooperation, but is diplomatic engagement, we could consult the NAC, or the North Atlantic Council, which is part of NATO, but is not the military part of NATO, about whether or not to do the plan before doing it. We could consult businesses. The private sector is obviously very relevant to a lot of these. That would be regulatory negotiation is the term for that. That probably came up a lot on water. I'm sure you all are familiar. Referendum consults the people for democracy reasons. The International Court of Justice counterplan consults the International Court of Justice about the plan's alignment with international law. This would be best against AFs that attempt to set norms or modify legal standards for the use of force. There's also a European Court of Justice. This one is more focused on human rights, but could certainly be consulted by the plan as well, or by the US government as well. We also have conditions. Conditions should be pretty common on this topic, I would guess. The common premise of these is that someone wants the AF to happen. You can use the AF as an incentive or a carrot. You can offer them the AF, but then not do it unless they meet a particular condition that we want them to meet. Implementation of the AF could be tied to democracy-related conditions, such as, hey, Turkey, we will not help you integrate your AI with NATO's AI unless you meet a particular set of democracy benchmarks. CMR-related conditions. So CMR, the issue I was describing in the US, is also a global concern. Countries of concern for CMR that are in NATO include, once again, Turkey, which you might know recently had a coup attempt in 2016, which is not a sign of healthy civil military relations. Poland and Hungary are also considered weak spots CMR-wise. So those could be countries about which such net benefits could be written. You could also impose human rights conditions, same kind of problem countries for those. Another type of condition could be burden sharing related. So you would only do the plan if Europe agrees to pitch in a particular set of resources to assist with the plan's implementation. And this would avoid spending type arguments. The common answer to do both with all of these is that the incentive is necessary to get the countries to do what we want. The only reason they would do what we want is that they want the carrot. So if we give them the carrot for free, they have no reason to then follow through on those things, because whatever the condition is not something these countries want to do by default or willingly. Last thing that I'll mention is threaten. This has not come up in a while, but the idea of this one is the opposite of conditions, which is that an actor does not want the plan. You threaten them with the plan unless they do something, typically human rights related. And then if they fail to do that thing, then you do the plan. So with conditions, you would read say yes evidence to say that countries would comply with the condition and that causes the plan. With threaten, you're reading say no evidence to say that countries would not listen to the threat and that we would then carry out the threat by doing the plan. Typically, this is human rights related, and the net benefit is usually about restoring our human rights credibility by threatening countries for human rights violations and then following through on what we say we're going to do. Does all of that make sense? Okay. Security cooperation. I'm not going to harp on the DoD picks, but there are a variety of them. We have written the Department of State counterplan. Any other agency is also competitive with security cooperation under this theory. I would imagine the most common one is going to be the US Trade Representative. The US Trade Representative negotiates trade agreements. A lot of the countries or a lot of the apps that are being written have stuff to do with trade or have stuff to do with economics. And so regulations could be economic rather than military. The court counterplan could compete off of security cooperation. I'm listing this one separately from the Asian conversation that we started with because the court counterplan has probably the clearest argument for why like the court itself cannot do security cooperation. So if you fiat whatever the court requires, the court would not be doing the cooperation pretty clearly, I would think. The net benefit is also probably the best for this because you can generate an internal one about something called the political question doctrine. Has anyone heard of this? Political question doctrine? Yeah. You want to take a stab at what that is? No, it's okay.
The way I understand like the courts shouldn't like interfere in like political questions that should be answered by like the executive or Congress.
Yeah, that's a really, really good answer. Importantly, not just questions that are politicized or have a political valence. Obviously, courts weigh in on stuff that is political all the time. What is meant by political here is quite narrow, which is that it is properly the purview of one of the other branches of government, like you said. It's either an executive issue or a congressional issue. Here, likely executive, because this is a foreign policy topic. But the idea would be that the court would weigh in something that is outside of its traditional sphere. They would try to compel a foreign policy course by trying to get the executive to do the plan. This would violate the political question doctrine. The net benefit would be that the political question doctrine is bad for a variety of reasons. It stops the court from doing oversight of a variety of national security activities, which would be good. And the PERM would not solve because the alignment between the executive and the court would mean that either precedent would not be set because the decision would be moot. If the dispute is moot in a court controversy, then the court ruling on that issue is typically not viewed as setting precedent as strongly, or because there is no conflict at all, which means the court's just reaffirming what the executive said. And so it's arguably not a political question violation. For similar reasons as I was just describing to the study counterplan about holistic authorization, so like authorize the app only if it's compliant with a set of grand strategy parameters, there is also an oversight pick that is kind of agent related and security cooperation related. This is kind of linked up with this issue of security cooperation being tied to security related benchmarks. But that also has a dimension that is linked to what parts of Congress oversee security cooperation activities. The ones that are authorized under Title 10 of the US Code, which is most of them, are overseen by the House and Senate Armed Services Committees. And so something that could be distinct about a counterplan is not just that it doesn't use the DoD, but it uses the DoD without being authorized under Title 10, which means it avoids House or Senate Armed Services oversight and could avoid potentially a politics disadvantage about the agendas of those committees. There is evidence that security cooperation is public or that it excludes classified programs. So doing the app in secret is potentially a counterplan. There is some mediocre neg evidence and not really app evidence as far as I've seen. This last one, just doing the app in secret. So don't disclose that the app is happening. Last thing that I'll talk about is cooperation with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So there's a variety of things that compete off of this phrase. I'm going to focus on the word with. So the word with, there are cards that requires direct connection and cards that it requires a significant nexus between the things where the cooperation is occurring. There are a lot of cards interpreting a case called Empegrin, which is an antitrust case that interprets the word with in the Sherman Act that have a lot of, and that produced a lot of definitions to this effect, because the word with in the phrase between or commerce with foreign nations in that law has been interpreted a bunch. And so there's a lot of questions about what with foreign nations means. Obviously, in this topic, we're also cooperating with foreign nations, so that's pretty relevant. If the nexus has to be direct and there has to be a significant one, that has a couple of implications. One, the intermediary counterplan. Don't work with NATO. Talk to Australia, who will in turn talk to NATO. Or talk to South Korea or Japan, who will in turn talk to NATO. This involves all the same actors. The net benefit comes from this thing called middle power theory, or relatedly, the network theory of international relations. The idea behind this is that countries' soft power comes not just from national qualities like the strength of their economic growth or their cultural output or their military strength, but rather that national power in the international system comes from where in the international system countries are located. And this theory conceives of IR as a network of relationships between different powers. So like the direct relationship between the US and China, for example, is pretty weak, or the direct relationship between the US and Russia is super weak. And there are countries that have links to both that are stronger, that derive power from their unique positioning as intermediaries in the international system. Now, this genre of counterplan makes more sense when we're cooperating with an adversary for this exact reason. The direct connection between the US and NATO is obviously quite strong. But there are cards that say the utilization of Australia or of South Korea and Japan are typically the intermediaries that people pick, strengthen their position as middle powers and enable them to wield more soft power on the world stage, which helps them. The direct connection element gets to another genre of counterplan, which is the multilateral counterplan. So don't just talk to NATO, make a proposal that applies to NATO, but also applies to all the other countries. So like go to the UN and make them an offer. The way that solves the case could just be that NATO says yes, and that results in the plan. But the reason it competes with is that the offer is not made to NATO. There is not a direct conversation with NATO that occurs. Instead, there is a proposal that is made in a general forum at no one in particular, which anybody could theoretically say yes to, but that results in either at least a consensus with NATO because of the reasons that the alliance would say yes to the AF, but also potentially in broader consensus that results in broader buy-in, more legitimacy for whatever it is that the AF is doing because of their neutrality, that kind of thing. Last thing that I will mention, I'll mention two last things. One is NATO as an organization, as opposed to NATO as its component parts. So I think that it is pretty clearly competitive on this topic to, instead of talking to NATO as an organization, to talk to all members of NATO separately, either in an informal grouping that exists already, or even in a new informal grouping. Like you could just call a meeting of NATO members, but not at like NATO headquarters, and like just propose the after them. And I think that that's competitive and could avoid a disad like DoD or NATO trade-off about overloading NATO's bureaucracy. And then lastly, there is also the North Atlantic Treaty Organization here. So just like there is at the beginning, the classic process word in this context, as in the USFG, could arguably be interpreted to mean that we have to cooperate with the entire North Atlantic Treaty Organization, making it competitive to exclude individual member states, we might want to shun for human rights reasons or for other reasons. There is an unconfirmed but sort of credible report that Hungary knew in advance of the Ukraine invasion that Russia was going to attack Ukraine and just like didn't tell anyone. Like they got advance warning. So like some NATO member that they are, I probably wouldn't want them to have our classified intelligence, given how that's like they're clearly not being a very good ally. So there's a reasonable argument to be made that we should exclude them from classified operations, Turkey being shunned for human rights reasons, or also for reasons of leaking technology to Russia. They still operate Russian anti-air systems despite the Russian invasion. So that is kind of that. Questions? I know I just like threw a bunch of information vomit at you. Hopefully this was helpful as an overview. No questions? Okay. Generally speaking, hopefully the takeaway from this has been like, I've obviously listed a bunch of stuff. Hopefully some of this was new to you, but as a general premise, I think that the big takeaway that you want to get from this is more kind of like the process of looking at a topic to see what components of the topic people are going to generate competition off of. In particular, watch this like security cooperation oversight authority space. It's pretty complicated. Nobody has quite cracked the code on this as far as any camp that I looked at all the camps to see if this was a thing that people had figured out. I don't think anybody has quite cracked the code on this. I feel like there's a really, really good set of files to be written in this area. So yeah, watch that space. Yeah.
So we could make like, because there's going to be like a time where the negative is going to say like it's unfair because the ads have unlimited choices to make. Can we like say like the negative have a good solution to have that much too? Because
So you're saying that the neg is saying the app is unfair?
yeah, because the app has more chances, like more topics to talk about within the resolution versus the negative when it has like only one.
Yeah, it's so I didn't talk about theory at all, which is a whole other conversation, but one of the common justifications for why the neg should get to read counterplans like this is that given how many advantages the app has, it's important for the neg to have options like this to get back in the game for sure.
Okay.
All right, go to next electives. Oh yes.
How do you think the international database?
Good for the neg.